I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode we are looking at Gurren Lagann, and specifically its animation. I find Gurren Lagann generally a really attractive anime in regards to its cast and what it represents and all these things, but what really attracted me to watch this anime, if I'm completely honest, was how it was animated. And it is for that reason why I want to try and talk about it and elaborate on some of my thoughts besides just it's really well animated. So in today's episode I want to talk about the sort of stylistic influence that Gurren Lagann gets, as well as we always do on these episodes, talk about some of the key animators that really were quite prominent on this project. I unfortunately can't always talk about all of them, but talk about some of the quote-unquote main ones, or those that made quite a few appearances. And then finally, just some takeaways and what we can learn from Gurren Lagann about animation, because I feel like that is probably the most important thing to come out of these analyses. What can we learn about the medium of animation, or Japanese animation? And by the way, for anyone who is new, I am Jamal. I like to think about anime on this podcast quite a lot, and I like to think it is kind of profound, but that is up for interpretation. But anyway, let's get into the episode for this week. That is episode 82 of the podcast, Gurren Lagann, an animation analysis. As always, before we get into the analysis and the meat of the podcast, I like to give you alerts in regards to spoilers, and this episode shouldn't really contain spoilers, to be honest. I'm going to be talking a lot more about the styles and the actual content itself within the anime. I would recommend watching it because it would make more sense. If you're to hear about these animators without watching it, it would be a bit weird. So I recommend watching Gurren Lagann, but if you haven't seen it, I wouldn't say that you're going to be that left out. Also, just on the side of disclaimers, this episode isn't going to be able to cover everything, just like any of my other animation analyses. I can't cover every animator which has touched Gurren Lagann. I can't talk about every influence on it. This is a 20 to 40 minute show, unfortunately, and so I can't really go through the entire history of sort of the mecha genre and all that, because that's kind of what we would be going into if I was to talk about this in so much depth. But I'm going to try and do my best to give you a sort of good overview of these animators and these styles and stuff which really make Gurren Lagann what it is. As I just said, there are so many influences when it comes to Gurren Lagann, and I could go on for a long time. We could talk about, and would end up getting into a discussion about the mecha genre, and how sort of the meta of animating mechas has changed and evolved over time, because when we really think about it, it is kind of, it hasn't been that long. I like to think that anime hasn't actually been a thing for very long when you really think about it. It's just about being a century, which maybe sounds like a lot, but when it comes to animating and the progression of the meta, things haven't been as fast as you might think they have. They've definitely progressed, but we would get into a really long conversation about how they have progressed across the past 50 or 40 years. And I'm obviously not willing to do that, so I'm going to sort of skip to the chase and say that the sort of main influence that underpins a lot of Gurren Lagann, we will kind of debate underpinning and style a bit later into the episode, but the main one is probably the Kaneda school of animation. By Kaneda, for those who aren't aware, I mean Yoshinori Kaneda, the animator. And now we have this style which has really been brought to the fore of animation, I would argue, well, maybe not the fore, but it's definitely, it's kept its influence throughout modern animation and modern Japanese animation. And in the case of Gurren Lagann, it is so prominent that it makes its place in almost every other episode. In regards to its aesthetic though, it takes this, what could be described as very snappy style. It focuses a lot on moving from one stance to another, often taking these diagonal poses or ones which move in diagonals or have these sort of diagonal facing or pointing limbs and arms and such. It often uses these lines which they end up either being sort of preemptive to predict where something will go, or they sort of forebode where something will go, or it is to trace back a movement which previously happened. And then when all these poses are put together and we have the lines in, it really works well to show where everything is going, and it often leads into a really epic sort of conclusion, in my opinion. With a lot of animation today that focuses on the in-between. When I say in-between, I don't mean in-between frames, I just mean things that are happening in between the stances or the very key poses. Stuff like smears are used to bring out the sort of in-between of a motion. That is where the emphasis comes in, but the emphasis of the Kannada style is really the A and B rather than the transition between A to B. The Kannada school of animation or Kannada style also has a sort of toolkit worth of techniques, or a toolkit full of techniques rather, which he's drawn on in the past, and animators today, which do sometimes adopt these techniques and do so in Gurren Lagann, take from this pool of things really. So we have stuff like the Kannada light flare, or the way of which Yoshinari Kannada drew the dragon, so the Kannada dragon, and things like that. So as much as it is a style, also it is sort of a pool of techniques and things to take from it. I'm still trying to figure out whether I should call it a technique, because I don't really know if a light flare is a technique. It's more of a thing of which you do, which could be described as a technique, but I'm mostly going to be talking about it in regards to sort of extracting from the pool of these techniques or things of which he did. And just a few examples of Kannada's main mecha works. We do have Mobile Suit Gundam as well, 079. But we also have stuff like Invisible Superman Zambot 3 and Plore Sanshiro. A more general point about influence, though, is it's kind of a point in regards to the Trigger and Gainax works, and it's how over time these works have sort of built upon each other, and these animators have progressed as they've worked through some of these works. So, for example, Fooly Cooly, Evangelion, Gunbuster and Diebuster, obviously Gurren Lagann, and then if we look into the future, we have stuff like Kill La Kill, B&A, Promare, Space Patrol Lulaco, and the point is that over time these styles of these animators, and just the general sort of aesthetic which comes with your typical Gainax trigger work has really been morphed by the works that came prior to it. And it's also adapted to context too, because the context of the anime is super important, and they're not just going to animate the same way they did before, but over time we've seen how these are built upon each other. I like to think that Promare is probably my favorite example of this, as well as Gurren Lagann too. And so now we're in that point of the episode where I am going to talk about key animators. As always, there are just a few things I like to establish. The order and who is in this is not based on competition or who is the best or anything like that. No, it's never a competition. These are just the animators which stood out to me and also probably contribute to the image of the anime the most, again, in my very subjective opinion. Also, the order which I'm saying them in is not a tier list, don't think of it like that. It's not best or worst, it's just what has come to me and what's going to serve the flow of this podcast the most. Or the best, sorry. And finally, this is just a general point that we usually talk about animators in twos, and this usually helps quite a lot because I like to sort of categorize them based on what they're going for and how they match with others, and that will influence our takeaways as we get further into the episode. So let's get into this. The first two animators I really want to speak about are Akira Amamiya and Hiroyuki Imaishi. You probably know Imaishi if you do pay attention to just general staff and directors. You most likely know Imaishi from as the director of this series. And he also has animation work in there too. He's done boards, he's directing, and he's also animating. So he has quite a lot on his plate, and I'm very surprised that he actually did animation work on this too. Reminds me quite quite a lot of what Sungo Park is doing recently, directing, boarding, and also animating at times, which I just find absolutely crazy. But in this case, Amamiya and Imaishi are what I would probably define as the core Kaneda-style animators within this work. A lot of how they move subjects and mechas and stuff are underpinned by this style, and you'll see it almost immediately and within almost any of their cuts. In the case of Akira Amamiya, they are probably most effective when it comes to animating impact and contact between objects. I really like how the Kaneda style works when it comes to animating impact and contact, because when we have a lot of these diagonal poses or ones which lean to being diagonal, if that makes some sort of sense, and when the lines feel very pointed, as a result, I think that creates the impression of pressure when it's colliding with an environment. It might not necessarily look like it's animated to look weighty or have more weight than the average non-Kaneda style cut, but how it's shaped and then how it hits the ground, I think just makes the illusion that it is hitting harder, or at least there's more pressure on the ground. Often because a lot of the Kanda style of animating today does lean towards exaggerating and embracing what diagonal shapes come with, a lot of the attacks which come from it, from these mechas which are being animated by Amamiya, appear more aggressive in my opinion, and they seem more rapid and urgent to fight and get into the battle. This is where Gurren Lagann kind of separates itself from a lot of other mecha anime, maybe, at least prior to its time. I'm not really going to include stuff like Prome because that's a different story, but if we go backwards and look at Evangelion or even Gundam, and it's not like Kaneda or Kanda style animators have never touched these works before, but the point is that Gurren Lagann separates itself by sort of going against the engineering and the realism of the notion of the mecha, by exaggerating a lot and by pushing the mecha to places to which it's never really been before with these different styles of animation. And it really brings forward the core of the anime, which is about the limitless potential of human beings and stuff like that. And by pushing the realism of the mecha, I think that really comes out. And one more extra quick point on Amamiya is that they animate a lot in threes, so that is one unique drawing for every sort of every 3 frames. That has nothing to do with in-betweens, by the way, because that's something I've gone wrong in the past, but it would be unique drawing and then unique drawing. That's sort of the pattern it goes in. And they also animate a lot in loops as well, so I think it creates a very unpredictable pattern when we are watching Amamiya. And what is exciting about their animation work is you end up questioning, or I did a lot, when are their loops going to break and when are they just going to sort of bust out in crazy action. And that is what I think is so exciting about the sort of standard Amamiya cuts. I don't have many points about Imaishi, but one way in which they differ from Amamiya when it comes to tackling this style is that they are a lot more versatile when it comes to line weight and line thickness. I still don't know the difference between those, if there is one. I would love for someone to tell me that, but they are a lot more versed in that versus Amamiya, which seems to stick very safely to one type of line weight. And that isn't a problem. It works perfectly fine for Amamiya's cuts, and considering that Amamiya has a lot more cuts on this project, it would seem almost a lot fairer for them to stay more consistent in order to get stuff done. But in the case of Imaishi, they seem to be able to really, or he is really able to switch between them. He's able to handle these much thicker and intimidating lines. When we see characters like Loginome, for example, or the end game of Gurren Lagann, when we're fighting with these massive things and we're also fighting at full strength, the lines become thicker, and Imaishi is able to tap into that, which then goes back to the core theme of the anime. And we'll talk a bit more about lines as we get through some of these animators. Moving on to the next animator, I did tell a bit of a lie when I said that I was going to talk about them all in pairs, but this one I kind of have to put in the middle based on how their style sort of blends into both of these, and this is Tadashi Hiramatsu. Hiramatsu is a very good place for us to continue this discussion because they are sort of the master of the thick line. That is really where their forte is. It's emphasis, emphasis, emphasis when it comes to these line weights. Although Hiramatsu, at least from what I've seen in Gurren Lagann, wouldn't necessarily classify as a Kannada school animator by any stretch, they are still very intentional when it comes to contact, and these, again, thick lines play a big part in this, in emphasizing the strength and the pressure between said subject and the ground, or just two subjects clashing together. Funnily enough, Hiramatsu animates some of the most symbolic punches within this anime. Probably the two most symbolic punches within the anime. And I think it works perfectly with them, and I don't think that anyone else could have done this any better. Just because the way in which they focus on exaggeration, and exaggeration's really their forte. You can see why they're such a great animator just within these two punch cuts alone. What is awesome in summary about the Hiramatsu punch, in my opinion, that isn't a actual name, but at least Hiramatsu's punches when they're animated, what is so cool about them is that they pay a lot of attention to how skin works, but also how we really magnify and exemplify it. So when Simon is being punched, or when Simon is doing the punching, the person who is being punched, can we call that person the punchee? But let's just call him the victim. What happens is that even when the fist makes contact, we have what is displacement going around the fist to make up for the skin or the lost volume of skin which is being contacted. But around it, what is amazing is that it sort of folds around the person's arm or their fist, which is obviously the displacement, but that creates a much bigger sense of impact. Almost as if you were to throw a boulder into water and then you'd have the water around it coming upwards. That's the displacement. But Hiramatsu does that on the face, and it just looks so much cooler versus an average punch, which would sort of make contact and that's it. If you even look frame by frame, I love how you can see when the punch is thrown, one of the first frames which goes into Simon or the other person who's being punched, their face sort of goes in as if it's like a bag or like punching a cake basically. And my point is that these animators are so creative when it comes to combat. No, I wouldn't say there's any part in Gurren Lagann that has sort of dry combat, maybe in the middle somewhere at the beginning of the time skip, but besides that, almost every bit of combat feels exciting, but also very in your face and over the top, because the point of Gurren Lagann is to go over the top, to break the conceivable top, which we thought was the limit to our potential. And these animators, I would also say, surpass their potential too. They're really able to tap into what we wouldn't consider as right or real by going beyond the real and pushing these forms and character designs and models as far as possible. And a tiny point on Hiramatsu, just to finish this little section for his animation, is that I really do like their character acting work as well. It does feature these strong, thick lines yet again, but even so, they're just generally a really good part of the team, honestly. These very nice, convincing performances when you need them. The thing is that an anime like Gurren Lagann, yes, you do have mechas doing a lot of their thing, but you have to remember that there are still characters in this, and I'm not trying to say for anyone that snapshots this, or you can't snapshot a podcast, but for anyone that tries to soundbite this, I'm not trying to say that this mecha anime focuses on the characters. No, I'm not saying that. They all do. All of them do. I don't understand that point at all, but I just mean to say that character acting plays an important part in mecha anime, just like it does in any other anime as well, and Hiramatsu pays attention to that, and I suppose we can also thank Imaishi for the boards and direction to include this in, because it's a very important part of animation that deserves to be in any anime, including Gurren Lagann. And then the final two animators I want to discuss are Yo Yoshinari and Sushio. This final pairing would be, I feel like it would be a crime to skip them, because these are the animators that are able to go big, and it's go big or go home for these animators. And they are incredibly good when it comes to their execution. In my very uninfluential opinion, I would say that Yoshinari and Sushio make Gurren Lagann what it is visually, and it really wouldn't be the same if it wasn't for these two staff in particular. In the case of Yoshinari, most of their animation work, not even just in Gurren Lagann, but generally, is underpinned by their sense of shape. And Yoshinari's shapes are very sharp, and they also curve quite a lot. So if there's a Yoshinari explosion, what you'll see is that it's made up of these layers of ember and flame and heat, but the smoke or the flames or whatever will be constructed by these very sharp shapes that they point out, they protrude outwards, and then they curve inwards, and then that meets another point, and then it will curve again. This might sound a bit weird, but I think Yoshinari's shapes come across as aggressive and almost confrontational. They're calling out the viewer in a way, not actually, but the way they come across, every explosion, every indication of spiral power within the air is calling the viewer. And I like that, honestly. Yoshinari, I feel like, is meant to be the animator that animates action, because every shape that not every, but most of their shapes are built towards this offensive look. Everything feels offensive when it comes to Yoshinari's work, and that is probably my favorite thing about them as an animator. This is also combined with these very dark and opaque shadows, which I really like in contrast to the shapes, or no, when they're put together actually, because when you can see the shapes, often behind it, or the shadow for the shape, the very aggressive shape, is an opaque shadow, so it kind of spreads itself more across the screen or within whatever you're watching or looking at. And when you consider that Gurren Lagann does take a lot of these shapes, which are very curved, because the point of it, well, it takes a lot of sharpness, but also a lot of curves because of how spirals work, which is a central theme to the show, and also drills as well. So these in combination work really well, I think. And finally, Yoshinari does dip quite a lot into the sort of Kannada style pool of techniques, so often embracing the light flare, maybe not just always in Gurren Lagann, but in other works as well. Has previously animated Kannada dragons before, again in other works, but I think just to get down Yoshinari as an animator, they are very able to adopt techniques when necessary. It isn't particularly within their style to do so, or it isn't the convention, but they're able to, it really just shows versatility, and someone who's able to adapt to a work when necessary. And I suppose under Imaishi's direction and sort of framework and vision for Gurren Lagann, Yoshinari is able to just bend to Imaishi's ideas. And I think that says a lot about the type of animator that Yoshinari is. I know I kind of went off about Yoshinari, but weirdly enough, Sushio animates very similarly. As in, a lot of the time when I was watching Gurren Lagann, which I was finishing a few months ago, around December and November, I think it was. That was when I was tweeting about it the most, I think, anyway. But the point is that Sushio animates so similarly, to the extent to which, not exactly the same, but to the extent to which I often confuse them when I'm looking at the cuts, or I'm watching the episode and I'm mumbling under my breath, oh, that's Yoshinari, right? And it ends up being Sushio. And then when I'm thinking, oh, this is Sushio, it ends up being Yoshinari. So I can never really tell between the two sometimes, until I actually sit down and check the information. Sushio often does indulge in these thicker lines, just like Hiramatsu, just like Imaishi, just like Yoshinari, not to undermine their work, but I just mean these are things which multiple animators on this work tap into, and Sushio is just about the same when it comes to that. Unlike maybe Hiramatsu, though, they're very consistent with it, and it's most of their cuts I feel contain that very thing. Often within black and white too, they stick to, or a lot of the cuts which they've had to animate for this work end up being these very dramatic black and white, kind of giving this pencil look to it all, or at least like ink on paper type look. And just to reiterate, that is going back to this subtext of strength and power and breaking the conventional, which Gurren Lagann is all about. So I think that brings us to a place to which we should really sort of condense everything into some takeaways and things we can take away from Gurren Lagann as an animation. What can we learn about it specifically? I think I put these points in the wrong order in my notes, but I was very tired when writing these, so please forgive me. But I think the first thing, and probably the most important, is that we need to rethink style and what style means. Gurren Lagann kind of reshaped how I view animation quote-unquote styles, mostly because I think style often makes us, or at least me, think that these are all separate paths, which we all have very separate styles, and maybe we have pools like the Canada school and stuff like that, but often we engage in very separate styles, or animators do so. But Gurren Lagann taught me that the notion of styles is very vague, and a lot of these styles intermix and they're at crossroads with one another rather than separate paths. In regards to stuff like Kaneda style, as I mentioned with Yoshinari, he's able to tap into some of these techniques within the pool, but it isn't particularly a Canada style animator. And the point is that animation isn't about being one style or not being the style. It's about sometimes taking things from some places and taking things from others and making that your own. And I think that's, although it sounds kind of basic and obvious, that's a very more productive way to think about animation and styles, rather than this person's this style, this person's that style, etc. We've seen it with other works in regards to, say, Yutaka Nakamura, who has influenced so many animators, but in very different ways. And then the last one, which honestly isn't as profound, but it's just how important lines are. Every drawing matters. I've said this before, every frame matters, and it's really how it's used. But I never really thought about how important line thickness can really be until I watched Gurren Lagann, mostly because it's used so much for communicating such simple things, but it shows how effective it actually is. Yes, it's backed up by the anger and strength of these characters, but it's also just a really subtle way of saying, okay, not subtle, but you don't need to say more when you see these mega thick lines that Sushio, for example, is animating across the biceps of Simon. You're able to tell what that means. It's an amazing shorthand for understanding character emotions, really. When we strip back animation and drawing and such, it is all back down to lines, and how we draw the line is so fundamental. And so I suppose it shows that every small element is so important for animation. Even the most basic of ideas, such as how thick you're drawing a line, can do so much for a cut. And with that being said, that is the analysis for this week. I'm not going to do a segment actually, because I'm trying to get episodes out on time. And as you know, for the past few weeks, and I didn't even do an episode last week, but for the past few weeks, I've been getting out episodes usually on Saturday mornings or really late Friday nights. And I really want to break that chain. And so I'm going to try and make this a bit shorter so I don't have to edit for longer. And hopefully it should get out on time. And then eventually, as things get a bit better, then I should have a bit more of a schedule and time to do segments. So that means that I'm just going to go straight to closing thoughts. We can quickly wrap up what we've been saying. I know I kind of did some takeaways, but wrap up everything from the episode, and then I will see you off for the end of the show. Gurren Lagann was always an anime that I was quite intrigued about, and even before I watched it, it did take me quite a while to watch it actually. It took me about months, I think, maybe if not a year, because I broke it down into, I would stop and start and stop and stop, but I eventually got there. But anyway, there are so many things which I was so intrigued about, from the mecha element to the character element to so many other things, but the animation was something that I was always intrigued about. But what was weird about those times was that I didn't really know how to describe what it was. I didn't really know what Kannada style was a few years ago versus now, and now I know. It feels so much cooler to really get engrossed within the work, and that's what I've really tried to do this episode. Everything within this anime really leads up to the core principle of Gurren Lagann, which is reaching new heights, breaking what we perceive to be rational and normative, because these are all constructed and they can be broken. And when we look at the styles of animators like Tadashi Hiramatsu, or Akira Amamiya, or Yo Yoshinari and Sushio, or everyone on this project, they ooze that idea within all of their cuts, and I can only respect so much an anime that doesn't only just say this in narrative, but means it in animation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Get In The Mecha. That has been episode 82. I'm very happy to be back doing the podcast. I know it's only like 1 week, but it felt really weird not doing a podcast that week. And I'm really happy to be back and doing this episode. I've also gained quite a few followers online. So welcome to anyone who is new to this podcast. And I didn't expect that, honestly, especially when it was my off week as well, when I wasn't even making any content. I was doing some stuff in the back, but I wasn't actually putting anything out, so that is really cool. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, you can support it or you can support the show generally by, 1, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. If you leave one, that'll be very appreciated, good or bad, just how you feel about the show. That is what is most important. You can do all the YouTube stuff, so that is liking, subscribing, pressing the bell, leaving a comment as well. That all helps the algorithm, helps other people find the show too, same as the review. And then thirdly and finally, that is telling other people about the podcast, be it online or on the phone or something like that. Please don't do it in their face. We are in very dangerous times right now. Please don't do that. But at least if you could tell at least one person about this podcast, that would be so appreciated. I would love to talk about Gurren Lagann and mecha anime more. That's something I need to do. I even put it in the description. I need to talk about mecha anime more on Get In The Mecha, ironically. We will do some more stuff, and of course more Evangelion as well. So thank you for listening. I will see you hopefully next week. I have been your host Jamal today, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Different by Chasersgaming.